Bom, gente, sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas aqui a mais um episódio do nosso canal Diplomacia com Café. Hoje eu vou falar sobre a obra República Tecnológica, os próximos 1000 anos. Espero que o planeta dure até lá, mas o ponto, e provavelmente vai durar, mas o ponto que eu quero trazer aqui é que a gente já está no capítulo 17, então, para quem não conseguiu ler os outros capítulos, vamos simplesmente continuar, não precisa ler os outros anteriores, porque os autores eles fazem questão de retratar o que eles estão falando em cada capítulo. Vamos então começar o capítulo 17. Vamos lá. In 1993, Robin Dunbar, a British anthropologist, attempted to calculate the maximum number of individuals with whom a person could plausibly maintain functional social relationships. Então, qual que seria o número de indivíduos com os quais uma pessoa poderia manter relações funcionais? É uma excelente pergunta. He surveyed the size of bands of humans who live in hunter-gatherer societies from southern Africa to New Guinea to southern Canada and came up with an average of 150 individuals per group, with the smallest community studied having 90 members and the largest 221. The figure, more often round to an average of 150 pessoas, has come to be known as Dunbar's number, and represents a sort of theoretical upper limit to the size of a human community whose members maintain direct contact and relationships with everyone else. Os uteritas, por exemplo, descendentes protestantes da Suíça e de outros lugares da Europa Central, que buscaram refúgios across the Africa, Midwest, and Canada in the 19th century, themselves identified 150 as the upper bound of the size of a farming community, and a report from the U.S. Department of the Interior from the early 1980s notes that when a group within a Hutterite enclave reaches 130 a 150 individuals, a daughter colony splits off from the parent. Similarly, a study from the early 1980s documented a community of likely 200 individuals living in the remote mountains of East Tennessee, nearly all of whom consider themselves related to some degree. Dunbar, who was born in Liverpool, Inglaterra, and taught at Oxford, has noted that the rough upper bound of 150 individuals seems to operate in other contexts, including the size of military formations within the Roman Empire army, as well as modern business units and companies. The task of maintaining human communities with significantly more than 150 or so individuals, of forming direct social relationships and lasting bonds with that many people, is exceedingly difficult. The monkeys and great apes of the world instinctively groom and comb the hair of other members of their groups as means of establishing social bonds, or bridges. Então, quer dizer, os macacos e os primatas, alguns tipos de primatas, penteiam o cabelo uns dos outros como meio de estabelecer pontes sociais. The trouble is that grooming dozens, let alone hundreds of other individuals on a regular basis, requires a very significant investment of time and creative energy. For humans, language principally fills a gap, allowing us to form substantial connections, real but more often imagined, with far greater numbers of people. Muitas vezes as pessoas formam conexões muito imaginativas, inclusive nas redes sociais, acreditando que ou que tem um alcance muito grande ou que tem um alcance muito pequeno. The nations of the world, in our sense of national identity or national culture, have been made possible by both spoken and written languages, allowing strangers to build with collective purpose and for the public, not merely private good. Without those imagined linkages, in the words of the political scientist Benedict Anderson, the tether between individuals who will almost certainly never meet or know one another directly, nothing of the modern era. From medicine to cities to artificial intelligence would be possible. But what sustains communities of individuals that number in the thousands or tens of thousands, millions, and even billions? What is capable of binding us together, of offering some degree of cohesion and common narrative, that might allow large groups to organize around something other than our own subsistence. It is, without any doubt, some blend or share of shared culture, language, history, heroes and villains, stories, and patterns of discourse. Yet, identification of anything approaching a national culture or values has in recent decades become increasingly fraught and problematic. Em 2017, o presidente francês Emmanuel Macron gave an address in which he said, "There is not a French culture, there are cultures in France." The remarks sparked a round of furious debates in the country, with Macron wading into a discussion that has structured life not only in Europe for nearly likely half a century, but also in America. His denial of the existence of a single French culture while attempting to highlight the cultural diversity of the newly cosmopolitan country struck at the heart of French identity. Yves Gigot, the mayor of Montereau perdão, esse nome aqui, a town in the Seine of the outskirts of Paris, fired back at Macron in an essay in Le Figaro critiquing the president's stance as contrary to the spirit of our republic. Gigot made clear that the aspiration to preserve something common didn't require a claim of superiority, and it didn't deny that other cultures are in the process of constant change. His point was instead that abandoning hope of preserving national and shared culture risks losing ourselves in materialism. The irony is that those often most skeptical of the market and the massive iniquities that result from a headlong embrace of capitalism often fail to appreciate that their own distaste for defending cultural concepts of nationhood leaves a void that the market itself fills. We in America, os autores do livro, né, norte-americanos, and more broadly in the West, have for the past half century resisted defining national cultures in the name of inclusivity. But inclusion into what? We have so hollowed out the national project that one could argue that there is no longer much of substance into which anyone might be included. A call today for affirming an American culture is something greater than these constituent parts, risks being cast as divisive and retrograde. Our sense of civic affiliation with one another has been allowed to wither and other means of fulfilling that desire for interpersonal tethers that have emerged. To fill the yawning gap, including the sense of belonging and investment in a great narrative of triumph and defeat that can be found, for instance, in sport. Such allegiances will emerge, will find a way to build coalitions and bands of warriors. To deny the human need for such affiliation has been a mistake. No country in the history of humankind has done more than the United States, imperfect as it may be, to construct a nation in which membership means something more than a shallow appeal to ethic or religious identity. Isso aqui é muito real. Are we to abandon any attempt at building on and expanding that project? The U.S., nearly 2.5 centuries after its founding, remains defined part by its contradictions. But other countries, including some of history's most vaunted democracies, continue to struggle with adopting a less parochial conception of national character. Em junho de 96, Jean-Marie Le Pen, né, presidente de direita ou de extrema-direita que concorreu contra o Macron, then the president of the National Front Party in France, dismissed the country's football team as a bit artificial, given the number of players who, while French citizens, were descendants of individuals from overseas territories, aqui faltou apóstrofe, in Africa. Aqui mostra, né, um mapinha do support for US Major League Baseball teams as of 2014. The experience of living in the US for many has grown too fractured, too desperate for many to allow for such a broad aspiration to something common shared. Indeed, it's almost as if Americans have ceded their ability to direct the country's cultural history to others, abandoning space for any such discussion to the editors of foreign textbooks about America, to histories being written by others from the outside looking in. Indeed, editors of the textbook American Culture, published in 2008, principally for students outside the United States learning English as a second language, offered a pithy and perhaps unintentionally critical assessment of the status of the American national project. The study of American culture has moved from being a search for a national character or a national identity to focus on American conflicts within and without. The issue is that humans will inevitably seek out ways of finding intimacy and also connection with strangers, with people they will never meet. Should we challenge? Inclusive é muito engraçado, né? Muitas pessoas têm realmente essa vontade de conhecer o desconhecido. Should we challenge the nation's role in that process? De fato, só se pode conhecer o que é desconhecido, né? Or allow it to step into a breach that would otherwise be filled by an ascendant consumer culture in which identity and belonging are defined by what one can afford to buy and as a result one's caste and wealth. This is perhaps the modern left's most glaring strategic mistake. It claims to be committed to curbing the excesses of the market, but its unwillingness to reckon with and take seriously the good can come from a national culture or shared identity, has only enabled the very excess it purports to oppose. Aqui estou falando que no dia 3 de outubro de 1965, Lee Kuan Yew gave a speech at an association of Singapore's liquor retailers, hoping to drum up support for the newly independent nation's cause. Vamos ver qual que é a causa que ele queria apoiar. It had been only a couple of months since the country split from Malaysia, and Lee had a future on its own. I'm calculating in terms of the next generation, in terms of the next 100 years, in terms of eternity, he said. And believe you me, for the next 1,000 years, we will be there. We'll be here. He added, it's people who calculate and think in those terms that deserve to survive. Too many Singapore's odds of survival after separating from the British Empire and later winning independence from Malaysia em 65 eram baixas, eram finas. The tiny nation, not much more than an island, lacked the natural resource population that would seem necessary for any sort of longevity. The country's citizens also spoke nearly a dozen languages and came from distinct cultural and religious traditions, each of which had ancient and deep roots in southern China, on the Indian subcontinent and across the Malay Peninsula. Então, estou falando aqui da história de Singapura, né, a separação do Império Britânico posterior da Malásia. Lee worked to manufacture some form of national identity for the young country, stitching together what he hoped would become a coherent whole from a diverse array of constituent parts. To that end, he and others unabashedly involved Singapore's government in a number of aspects of the private lives of its citizens, including everything from appropriate marriage to the search of a spouse. At a political rally, que neste ano de 1986, o Lee, ele fez o quê? The case that intervention in the private domains of the country's citizens was a necessary component of constructing and building a nation. We sang different songs in different languages, he said. We didn't laugh at the same jokes, because you can crack a joke in Hokkien, he added, referring to one of the country's Chinese dialects, but for 40% of the population won't follow. For most of the 20th century, at least 12 Chinese dialects had been spoken in Singapore, including Cantonese, Hokkien, Hainanese, and Shanghainese. The rise and increasing prominence of Chinese dialects in the territory was a relatively recent development. The British colony, no caso a Singapura, through the 19th and early 20th centuries had emphasized Malay as opposed to Chinese, given that, as one historian has noted, Singapore was considered part of a larger Malay world in which Malay was the main lingua franca. A Gov review completed in 1979 found that the vast majority of children in the newly independent nation, 85%, spoke a language other than English or Mandarin at home. The authors of the report wrote, one of the dangers of secular education in foreign tongue is the risk of losing the traditional values of one's people and the acquisition of the more spurious fashions of the West. Isso é muito, muito real, isso, né? A shared language was seen as vital to the nation's ability to defend its culture against encroachment, and indeed survive over the longer term. A society unguided by moral values can hardly be expected to remain cohesive under stress. Noted the Gov study, which came to be known as the Gov Report after its principal author, Goh Keng Swee. Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister under Lee, it's a commitment to a common set of values that will determine the degree to which people of race and migrant origin will be willing and able to defend their collective interest. A plan has hatched shortly thereafter to require that all Chinese students learn Mandarin at school instead of the dialects that they had been speaking at home. It was a decisive and controversial move, one with far-reaching consequences for generations of the country's families. Singapore used to be like a linguistic tropical rainforest, overgrown and a bit chaotic, but very vibrant and thriving. Tan Dan Fong, who served on the country's National Translation Committee, said in an interview in 2017. Now, after decades of pruning and cutting, it's a garden focused on cash crops. Learn English or Mandarin to get ahead, and the rest is useless, so we cut it down. For his part, Lee continued to make the case that learning Chinese and an ability to converse with citizens from across the country was essentially for the psychological development and coherence of young Singaporeans of Chinese descent. And many credit Lee for essentially rescuing the nation from devolving to a clash of competing bonds formed along ethnic or linguistic loyalties. Saragavan Gopinathan, a former dean of the National Institute of Education Singapore, wrote in 1979 the country's language policies were instrumental in constructing and maintaining the cultural personality of the nation. Lee later considered relaxing his grip on the country's development in certain limited domains. This is a new phase, de acordo com Lee. Por quê? He explained at the National Day Rally in 1986. Give them the option, you decide, you make up your mind, you exercise the choice to pay the price. The essence of Singapore, whatever the mix of causes that propel its rise, has been undeniable. In 1960, Singapore's per capita gross domestic product was only $428 by 2023. Its GDP per capita had risen to valor extremamente maior. One of the steepest and most unrelenting climbs of any country in the 20th century and perhaps in modern history. Esse número aqui realmente é muito grande. É o valor de um Bitcoin quase, né? Na cotação atual. Lembrando que o Bitcoin já valeu esse valor também. Few, if anyone, could take issue with the view that a single individual Lee was absolutely critical to Singapore's rise over its half-century of existence. As Henry Kissinger, its rise over its first century of existence. As Henry Kissinger put it, in the case of Lee's leadership, the ancient argument whether a circumstance of personality shapes events was settled in favor of the later. Ou seja, aqui, personality shaping events. No caso, só marcar aqui diferente. Events, aqui, later. Settled, aqui. Quer dizer que a personalidade é usada, né, instrumentalizada pelos eventos. Was settled aqui. The circumstance or personality shapes events. Was settled in favor of the later. That ancient argument had stretched back to at least the 19th century, with Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish historian, wrote in 1840 of the great man who had been the indispensable savior of his epoch, the lightning without which the fuel never would come burnt. The view that lone individuals were the principal drivers of history was so common at the time. The Panthéon in Paris, which was built in the 18th century to house the remains of the country's most distinguished politicians, philosophers, generals, include sculptures of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Napoleon, in a pediment above 22 soaring imposing Corinthian columns. An inscription in the stone, large capital letters legible from the street, "Un grand homme, la patrie reconnaissante," to the great man, the grateful nation. a singular emphasis on the acts and thoughts of lone individuals in assessing a sweep of human affairs that was also driven by economic and political forces, among others, was undoubtedly misplaced. Many may also be unable to look past the reference to men at the exclusion of women. But why are we incapable of disavowing the sexism parochial sentiment without jettisoning any sense of the heroic as well? Our shaft away as a culture from this type of thinking, from veneration of leaders, is both a symptom and a cause of our current condition. We have grown wary and skeptical of leadership itself. The heroic has for most gone the way of the mythological, relics of a past that we tell ourselves are irredeemably rooted in a history of domination and conquest. The loss of interest in this way of thinking, narrow and flawed as it was, coincided with the culture's broader abandonment of such interest in character or virtue. Seemingly ineffable concepts that could not be reduced to the psychological and moral materialism of the modern age. Our mistake, however, was to throw everything out instead of simply the bigotry and narrow-mindedness. Vamos ver quais deveres de casa eu vou dar para vocês. The essential failure of the contemporary left has been to deprive itself of the opportunity to talk about national identity. An identity from blood and soil conceptions of peoplehood. Essa questão de identidade aí é a questão do jus sanguíneo, jus solis, né, para se caracterizar cidadão de algum país, por exemplo. The political left in both Europe and the US neutered itself decades ago, preventing its advocates from having a forceful and forthright conversation about national identity at all. An identity that might have been linked to a cultural specific set of historical antecedents, but rose up beyond them to encompass those who were willing to join. Indeed, a generation of academics and writers refused to patrol the boundaries of the emotional nation at all. The imagined community of Anderson. Richard Sennett, a sociology professor at the London School of Economics, suggested that it may be possible to find ways of cutting together without relying on what he describes as the evil of a shared national identity. The political philosopher Martha Nussbaum similarly castigated patriotic pride as morally dangerous, urging that our primary allegiance should be to the community of human beings in the entire world. Their project essentially was post-national. Their move, however, toward an abolition of the nation was ill-advised and premature, and the left has been slow in recognizing its own mistake. Gente, vou deixar aqui para vocês algumas páginas, tá? Até a página 37, começando pela 33. Vamos terminar aqui mais um pedaço. In 1882, Ernest Renan, Renan, a French philosopher who was the descendant of fishermen, delivered a speech at the Sorbonne in Paris that was entitled Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? What's a nation? He was among the first writers to attempt to distinguish the concept of a nation from a more limited or narrow sense of ethnic or racial identity. Noting that the graver mistake occurs when race is confused with nation, Renan gave voice to a far more enduring, robust concept of the nation, that grand and mysterious collective project in a way that the educated class all but abandoned the post-war period. He described the nation as a vast solidarity constituted by the sentiment of the sacrifice one has made, and those one is yet prepared to make. A national project for Renan presupposes a past but is summarized in the present by a tangible fact. Constant, the clearly expressed desire to continue a common life. It is that common life with which we are at risk of losing touch. Renan famously described the nation as an everyday plebiscite, and it must now be renewed. The necessary task of building the nation, of constructing a collective identity and shared mythology is at risk of being lost because we grew too fearful of alienating anyone, of depriving anyone of the ability to participate in the common project. It's this interest in mythology, in shared narratives, and that we have as a culture taken too far. Palantir takes its name from the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien. And some have suggested that Tolkien referenced our favorites of the far right. The critique is representative of the left's broader error, with both substantive and strategic. An interest in rooting the aims of a corporate enterprise in a broader context and mythology should be celebrated, not dismissed. We need more common tomes, more shared stories, not fewer. Even they must be read critically over the time. Bom, gente, ficamos por aqui com a leitura da obra República Tecnológica, não é? Os próximos 1000 anos, e vamos, né, provavelmente para o último capítulo. E até o próximo episódio.